When a hard-working employee discovers that his boss has stolen his groundbreaking idea to climb the corporate ladder, he vows to take revenge. But what begins as a fight for recognition quickly unravels into a shocking web of lies, embezzlement, and betrayal. As he exposes the truth, he learns his corrupt boss isn't the only one hiding dark secrets. With his career, and the company's future, on the line, he must risk everything to bring down those who wronged him. This is a gripping tale of justice, revenge, and the dangerous cost of uncovering the truth. For 5 years, I gave everything to my job. Early mornings, late nights, skipped holidays, it didn't matter. I was the guy who stayed behind to fix problems, the one who'd sacrifice my weekend plans to meet a deadline. I thought that's how you earn success, by working harder than everyone else. I believed if I kept pushing, someone would eventually notice my dedication and reward me for it. That someone was supposed to be Richard, my boss. From the moment I joined the company, he was the guy in charge of my future. He had the power to approve raises, promote people, and make or break careers. At first, I thought Richard respected me. He'd say things like, "You're my go-to guy, the one I can always count on," and I ate it up. I wanted to believe he meant it. But over time, it became clear that Richard was only interested in two things: looking good and making sure someone else did the work to get him there. Richard was what you'd call a professional credit thief. He had this smooth way of swooping in at the last second, slapping his name on whatever project was about to succeed, and taking all the glory. He didn't care about who did the actual work. As long as he could spin it to make himself look good, that's all that mattered. For years, I put up with it. What else could I do? I wasn't in a position to fight back. Besides, I told myself it wasn't worth making waves. As long as I kept my head down and did my job, eventually I'd get my shot. But deep down, I knew the truth: as long as Richard was in charge, my shot would never come. Things hit a breaking point when the company started pursuing a high-stakes client. This wasn't just any deal, it was the deal. If we landed it, it would keep us afloat for years and secure everyone's jobs, including mine. But if we blew it, the company would likely go under. The pressure was enormous, and Richard was cracking under it. He called a team meeting to brainstorm ideas for the pitch. Well, brainstorm might be too generous of a word. Mostly, Richard barked at us about how important this was, how we needed to bring him something amazing, and how our jobs depended on it. His tone wasn't inspiring, it was desperate. I could see it in his face: he had no idea how to win the client. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. That should have worried me, but instead, it gave me an idea. I went home that night and started working on the pitch myself. Not because Richard asked me to, he hadn't, but because I was tired of waiting for him to step up. If I wanted this deal to happen, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. I stayed up all night, researching the client, their competitors, and their pain points. I crafted a strategy so airtight, so innovative, I knew it would blow them away. By the time I finished, I was exhausted, but proud. For once, I wasn't just reacting to problems, I was taking the lead. The next morning, I printed everything out, stapled it neatly, and walked into Richard's office. He was sitting behind his desk, scrolling through emails and looking stressed. "Hey, Richard," I said, holding out the documents. "I've been working on something for the client pitch. I think it could really make a difference." He glanced up, barely interested. "Yeah. What is it?" "It's a strategy to position us as the perfect partner for them," I said, handing him the papers. I outlined their biggest challenges and how we can solve them. It's all in there: targeted campaigns, ROI projections, everything. Richard took the stack and flipped through it lazily at first. Then, something caught his eye. He stopped and started reading more carefully. By the time he reached the last page, his expression had shifted completely. "This is good," he said finally. I couldn't help but smile. I thought so too. "If you want, I can present it to the client. I know the material inside and out." "No," Richard said quickly, setting the papers down. I frowned. "No. I'll handle it," he said, his tone final. "Are you sure?" "I really think." I said I'll handle it, he snapped, cutting me off. Then, seeing the look on my face, he softened. Don't worry, I'll make sure the higher-ups know it was a team effort. You'll get credit. I hesitated, but what could I say? He was my boss. If he wanted to take the lead, I couldn't stop him. So I nodded and left his office, telling myself this was still a win. Richard would present the pitch, the client would love it, and I'd finally get the recognition I deserved. Or so I thought. The meeting with the client happened a few days later. Richard went in alone, leaving the rest of the team at the office. I spent the entire morning pacing, unable to focus on anything else. By lunchtime, Richard was back. They signed, he announced to the office, grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. We got the deal. The room erupted into cheers. People clapped Richard on the back, congratulating him like he'd just pulled off a miracle. I waited, hoping he'd say something about my contribution. But he didn't. Not a single word. Later that afternoon, I overheard him talking to the CEO. It was a tough sell, Richard said, but I came up with a strategy that really resonated with them. They loved it. His strategy. My stomach churned. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just forgot to mention me in the moment. Maybe he'd bring it up later. But deep down, I knew the truth. Richard had stolen my work. I confronted him in his office that evening, after everyone else had gone home. Why didn't you tell them it was my pitch? I demanded. Richard didn't even look up from his computer. Look, Lucas, you're part of the team. That means we all contribute in our own ways. That wasn't a team effort, I said, my voice rising. That was my work. You can't just take credit for it. Richard finally looked at me, smirking. Welcome to the real world, kid. It's not about who does the work, it's about who gets the results. And right now, the results are making me look very good. So if I were you, I'd sit back and enjoy the fact that you still have a job. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. I couldn't believe the arrogance, the audacity. But as the shock wore off, it was replaced by something else. Anger. No, not just anger, determination. I walked out of his office that night with a new sense of purpose. Richard might have won this round, but he hadn't won the war. Not yet. I couldn't let it go. Every time I saw Richard strolling around the office, basking in his stolen glory, it made my blood boil. He'd stolen my idea and used it to climb higher while I was left in the shadows. Worse, no one questioned it. To them, he was the genius who saved the company. And me? Just another nameless cog in the machine. But I wasn't going to stay a cog. Not anymore. At first, I thought about going to HR, surely, someone in management would care if they knew the truth, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wouldn't work. Richard was charming, persuasive. He'd spin the situation, turn it back on me somehow. Maybe he'd claim I was bitter or jealous, trying to undermine him out of spite. No, I couldn't rely on HR to fix this for me. If I wanted justice, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. That's when I started paying attention. Close attention. Richard had gotten comfortable, too comfortable. He was riding high on the success of the deal, walking around the office like he owned the place. But I knew from experience that confidence like his often came with carelessness. People like Richard always think they're untouchable, invincible. I just had to find the cracks in his armor. It didn't take long to uncover the first crack. One night, after most of the office had cleared out, I decided to stay late. Not to work, at least, not on my assigned tasks. I had a different goal in mind, Richard's computer. I'd noticed he often left it unlocked when he left for the day, probably assuming no one would dare to touch it. That was his first mistake. I waited until the cleaning staff had come and gone, then made my move. I slipped into his office, closed the door behind me, and sat down at his desk. My heart pounded as I wiggled the mouse to wake up the screen. Sure enough, it was unlocked. For a second, I hesitated. What if I got caught? What if this backfired? But then I thought about everything Richard had taken from me, my work, my recognition, my chance at a better career, and my hesitation vanished. I started digging through his emails first. Most of it was the usual corporate nonsense, meeting requests, project updates, vendor negotiations. But then I found something interesting, an email thread between Richard and a man I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Invoice for consulting services." The man, let's call him John, was thanking Richard for a recent payment, and attached to the email was an invoice for consulting work totaling $12,000. That might not have meant anything on its own, but I knew for a fact our department hadn't hired any consultants. I'd been involved in nearly every project we'd worked on for the past year, and there was no way I'd have missed a $12,000 expenditure. I dug deeper, pulling up more emails between Richard and John. It turned out this wasn't a one-time payment. Richard had been funneling money to this so-called consultant for months. Something about it didn't sit right. I saved the emails to a USB drive and kept digging. My next discovery came from his expense reports. These were easier to access because Richard often left paper copies sitting on his desk. I found a stack of them in a folder labeled "Pending Approvals." Flipping through, I noticed a pattern. Richard had been filing expenses for business trips that didn't add up. Flights to cities where we had no clients. Hotel stays at 5-star resorts. Dinners that cost more than my monthly rent. All of it labeled as client meetings or team-building retreats. I took photos of every page. By the time I was done, I had a mountain of evidence suggesting Richard had been bleeding the company dry for years. But it wasn't enough. If I was going to bring him down, I needed more. Over the next few weeks, I became a ghost. I stopped engaging in office small talk, stopped participating in meetings unless absolutely necessary. I didn't want to give Richard any reason to notice me. While he basked in his stolen glory, I worked quietly, piecing together every scrap of dirt I could find on him. That's when I uncovered the real bombshell. One night, while combing through old email archives, I stumbled across a thread from when Richard was first hired. In it, he'd submitted a resume that, at first glance, looked impressive. But something about it didn't sit right with me. He claimed to have worked at a high-profile tech firm for 3 years, but I'd never heard him mention it in conversation. Curious, I did some digging. A quick search revealed the firm didn't even exist. I double-checked, triple-checked. It wasn't a typo or a misunderstanding. Richard had completely fabricated his work history. And not just that one job. A deeper dive revealed at least 2 other companies on his resume were fake, along with a degree from a university that didn't exist. This was it. This was the nail in the coffin. By now, I had enough dirt to ruin Richard 10 times over. But I wasn't about to go running to HR or the CEO with a folder full of evidence. No, that would have been too easy, too quiet. Richard had humiliated me, stolen from me, and made me feel powerless. I wanted his downfall to be public. I wanted him to feel the same sense of humiliation and betrayal that he'd made me feel. I started planning my move carefully. It wasn't just about timing, it was about making sure there was no way for him to recover. I needed to set a trap so airtight that when it sprung, he wouldn't even have room to wiggle out. The perfect opportunity presented itself a few weeks later, during the company's quarterly all-hands meeting. Richard was scheduled to give a presentation on the success of the new client deal, the very deal he'd stolen from me. The thought of sitting there, listening to him take credit for my work again, was enough to make my skin crawl. But this time, I wouldn't just be sitting there. This time, I'd be pulling the strings. The quarterly all-hands meeting was a big deal. Executives, managers, and team leads from every department gathered in the main conference hall, while others joined remotely. It was the kind of event where people dressed a little sharper, walked a little straighter, and kept their eyes glued to the CEO to avoid missing anything important. Normally, I'd sit in the back, half listening while mentally planning out my to-do list for the week. But not this time. This time, I had a mission. The meeting began like it always did, with the CEO giving an update on company goals and highlighting the departments that had performed well over the quarter. Predictably, Richard's team, our team, was singled out as one of the stars. Thanks to Richard's innovative leadership, the CEO said, we landed one of the biggest clients in our company's history. Richard, why don't you tell us how you pulled it off? The audience clapped politely as Richard strode up to the podium, grinning like the cat that ate the canary. He adjusted the microphone and launched into his speech, spinning his usual web of self-aggrandizing nonsense. I won't lie, he began, with a humble brag tone that made my skin crawl. It was a tough negotiation. The client had high expectations, and we had to really think outside the box to meet them. But with a lot of late nights and strategic thinking, we pulled through. This was a team effort, of course, but I'm proud to have been able to lead us to success. I clenched my fists under the table. Team effort. Strategic thinking. Every word out of his mouth felt like a slap in the face. But I stayed calm. I knew what was coming next. Richard clicked to the next slide in his presentation, which displayed a summary of the client's problem and the solution we'd pitched. It was, of course, the strategy one had spent countless sleepless hours developing. My strategy. My work. Seeing it displayed up there with Richard standing in front of it, claiming it as his own, made my blood boil. And that's when I saw my opening. A few days before the meeting, I had reached out to Sarah, one of the company's higher-ups in a different department. Sarah was sharp, no nonsense, and one of the few people I trusted. I'd shown her everything I'd uncovered about Richard, the fake resume, the embezzlement, the falsified expense reports. At first, she'd been skeptical. Are you sure about this? She'd asked. Positive, I'd said, handing her the stack of evidence. I've been gathering this for weeks. If you don't believe me, check it yourself. She'd called me later that evening, her voice tight with anger. You're right. He's a fraud. This is bad, really bad. The CEO needs to know about this immediately. I agree, I'd said. But I don't want this handled quietly. Richard didn't just steal from the company, he stole from me. I want everyone to see him for who he really is. Sarah had hesitated, but eventually, she agreed. Fine, she said. But it has to be done carefully. We can't afford to make a scene without hard proof. I'll take care of it, I'd assured her. Now, sitting in the meeting room, I glanced at Sarah, who was seated near the front. She gave me a small nod, a signal that everything was in place. Richard was midway through his speech when I raised my hand. Excuse me, Richard, I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. Can I ask a question? He looked startled for a moment, but quickly recovered. Of course, Lucas. Go ahead. I stood up, making sure everyone in the room, and on the video call, could see me. You mentioned that this pitch was a team effort, I began. Could you clarify what your specific contributions were to the strategy? The room went silent. Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard. Well, as the team lead, I oversaw the entire process and made key decisions about the direction we took, he said, his voice a little less confident than before. So you're saying you were directly involved in developing the strategy? I pressed. Richard's smile faltered. Yes. Like I said, it was a team effort, but I took the lead on the big picture ideas. I nodded, pretending to accept his answer. Interesting, I said. Because from what I remember, I was the one who stayed up all night working on that pitch. I was the one who developed the strategy, wrote the proposal, and created the presentation. Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard's face turned red. Lucas, this isn't the time or place for. No, I think it's exactly the time and place, I said, cutting him off. Because I think everyone here deserves to know the truth. I turned to the audience. This pitch wasn't a team effort. It was my work. Richard didn't contribute a single thing to it. And this isn't the first time he's taken credit for someone else's work either. The room erupted into whispers. The CEO, who had been sitting quietly until now, held up a hand to silence everyone. Lucas, that's a serious accusation, he said. Do you have any evidence to back it up? I smiled. Actually, I do. I walked to the front of the room, where Sarah handed me a folder. I opened it and began distributing copies of the documents to the CEO, the executives, and anyone else who needed to see them. These are emails, expense reports, and other records that prove Richard has been stealing from the company for years, I said. He's been filing fake expense claims, funneling money to a non-existent consulting firm, and lying about his qualifications. And if you don't believe me, feel free to verify it yourself. The CEO's face darkened as he flipped through the pages. Is this true, Richard? He demanded. Richard stammered, his confident facade crumbling. I don't know what he's talking about. This is all a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, I said. And if you need more proof, I have plenty of it. At that moment, Sarah spoke up. I've already reviewed the evidence, she said, her voice calm but firm. Everything Lucas is saying checks out. Richard has been defrauding this company for years. The CEO turned to Richard, his expression cold. You're done, he said. Security will escort you out of the building. Don't bother coming back. Richard tried to protest, but it was no use. 2 security guards appeared at the door and let him out, his face pale and sweaty. The room was dead silent as the door closed behind him. After the meeting, the CEO pulled me aside. Lucas, he said, I owe you an apology. You should have gotten the credit for that pitch from the beginning. Richard fooled all of us, but you've shown incredible integrity. We're lucky to have you here. By the end of the week, Richard was out of a job, and I was promoted to his position. For the first time in years, I felt like my hard work was finally being recognized. Justice doesn't always come easy. Sometimes, you have to fight for it. But standing up for yourself, even when it's risky, is always worth it. In the days that followed Richard's public downfall, I was riding high. The office was buzzing with the news of his ousting, and I was no longer just that guy from the team. People were congratulating me in the halls, patting me on the back for exposing a fraud. The promotion was official, and I'd moved into Richard's old office, a bittersweet victory. I told myself this was the end of the nightmare, the justice I had been waiting for. But then, one late afternoon, I received an email that changed everything. The subject line read, "Do you know the whole story?" It was from an anonymous sender. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but something about the timing made me hesitate. I opened it. The message was short, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Richard isn't the only one with skeletons in the closet. Be careful who you trust. Attached to the email was a single PDF. I clicked it open, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The document was a detailed list of transactions, payments made to the same fake consulting firm Richard had been using to siphon company money. Only these payments weren't from Richard's account. They were from Sarah's. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Sarah had been my ally, the one person who believed in me and helped me bring Richard down. She was the one who vouched for me in front of the CEO. But as I scrolled through the document, the pattern was clear. Sarah had been working with Richard all along. It wasn't just a few payments either. This went back years, long before I even joined the company. Richard might have been the face of the operation, but Sarah had been pulling strings behind the scenes, using him as a cover while she embezzled even more money than he did. I sat there staring at the screen, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Richard wasn't the mastermind, he was just a pawn. Sarah had set him up to take the fall. And I had played right into her hands. I couldn't sit still. I paced around the office, trying to process what to do next. If I exposed Sarah, it could mean the end of her career, and possibly mine. She was far more powerful than Richard ever was, deeply connected to the CEO and the board. If she found out I knew the truth, she wouldn't hesitate to crush me. But at the same time, how could I stay silent? After everything I'd been through, after everything I'd fought for, could I really let another fraud get away with it? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Sarah had used me. She'd let me do the dirty work of taking down Richard so she could walk away clean. If I hadn't uncovered the truth, she would have continued stealing, maybe even pinning the blame on me someday. No. I couldn't let her win. The next morning, I went into the office with a plan. If Sarah thought she could manipulate me, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I requested a one-on-one meeting with her under the pretense of discussing my new role. She agreed without hesitation, smiling warmly when I walked into her office. "Lucas," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "How's the transition going? I know taking over Richard's position can be a big adjustment." "It's going well," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." "Oh?" she asked, tilting her head. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I got an interesting email yesterday. It was about Richard, and you." Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Me? What do you mean?" I pulled out a printed copy of the PDF and slid it across her desk. "These payments," I said. "They don't look like a mistake to me. Care to explain?" Sarah's face went pale, but she quickly composed herself. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Lucas," she said calmly, "I don't know where you got this, but it's clearly some kind of misunderstanding." "Don't insult my intelligence," I said, my voice sharp. "You've been using the same fake consulting firm as Richard. This wasn't just him, you were in on it. And now that he's out of the picture, I'm guessing you think no one will connect the dots." Sarah's expression hardened. "You need to be very careful about the accusations you're making," she said. "I'm not making accusations," I shot back. "I'm stating facts. And unless you want me to take these facts to the CEO, I suggest you start talking." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes cold and calculating. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. You're right. I was involved. But before you go playing hero again, you should think about the consequences." "Consequences?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. "Do you really think the CEO will believe you over me? I've been here for over a decade. I've built relationships, earned trust. And you? You're just the guy who got lucky exposing Richard. If you try to take me down, you'll only end up destroying yourself." For a moment, her words rattled me. She wasn't wrong, she had far more power and influence than I did. But then I thought about everything I'd uncovered, everything she'd done, and I realized I didn't care about the risks. "I'm not scared of you," I said firmly. "And I'm not backing down. You might have fooled everyone else, but your time is up." I spent the next few days gathering even more evidence against Sarah. It wasn't easy, she was much more careful than Richard had been, but eventually, I had enough to make my case. Then I scheduled a meeting with the CEO. When I walked into his office, he looked surprised to see me. "Lucas," he said. "What's this about?" "It's about Sarah," I said, handing him a folder. "You need to see this." I watched as he flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. By the time he finished, he looked up at me, his jaw tight. This is serious," he said. "It is," I agreed. "And I'm prepared to go public with it if necessary." The CEO leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Leave this with me," he said finally. "I'll handle it." The fallout was swift and brutal. Within a week, Sarah was gone, escorted out of the building just like Richard had been. The company issued a public statement about ethical violations, but the details were kept vague. Still, word got around. Sarah's reputation was ruined, and there was no recovering from it. As for me, I stayed quiet, letting the CEO take the credit for cleaning house. I didn't need the spotlight this time. I had what I wanted, the frauds were gone, and my position was secure. But the experience left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. I'd gone into this fight thinking I was battling one villain, only to discover the rot went deeper than I ever imagined. It made me wonder, how many more Sarahs and Richards were out there, hiding behind their smiles and handshakes. I didn't know the answer. But one thing was certain, I'd never let my guard down again.